14 cities. Named. Located. Described. Pull up Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville's 1747 Nouvel Atlas de la Chine, the most precise cartographic survey of Central Asia, produced by the French Royal Geographical Society in the 18th century. Find the territory that European geographers labeled Tartaria. Count the settlements d'Anville placed there. Not vague regional labels, but named population centers, with coordinates, with notes on their administrative function, with references to the sources d'Anville used to locate them. 14 of them appear in the 1747 edition that do not appear in the revised European geographical literature of the 1820s. Before we go further, a necessary stop. The name Tartaria has become, in recent years, the anchor of an internet theory claiming a technologically advanced global civilization was deliberately erased from history. That theory is not what this video is about. The mud flood hypothesis is not supported by geology or archaeology. The claim that 19th century buildings were constructed by a lost civilization is not supported by any verified primary source. This channel does not present speculation as fact. What does exist in the documentary record is a specific and verifiable cartographic question, one that the Tartaria conspiracy theory has obscured rather than illuminated. 14 named settlements appear in a French royal survey in 1747. The revised geographical literature of the early 19th century does not list them. The question is not whether a hidden empire existed. The question is what d'Anville was mapping, and why the revision happened when it did. Those questions have answers. They are not conspiratorial, but they are not simple. Here is what d'Anville's survey actually was, and what it was built from. Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville was not a traveler. He was a cabinet geographer, a scholar who compiled maps from sources rather than from personal observation. His method was specific and documented. He gathered missionary reports, diplomatic correspondence, merchant accounts, and the cartographic work of earlier European and Chinese surveyors, evaluated their reliability against each other, and produced synthesis maps that were, by the standards of 18th century European geography, unusually rigorous about distinguishing between what was known with confidence and what was estimated. The 1747 Nouvel Atlas de la Chine was commissioned by the French royal court and drew heavily on a specific source that no earlier European cartographer had accessed at the same scale. The Qing Emperor's imperial survey of China and its surrounding territories, conducted between 1708 and 1718 by Jesuit missionaries working under imperial direction. The Jesuit survey used triangulation methods, the most precise cartographic technique available in the period, and produced a level of geographic detail for the interior of Asia that European cartographers had not previously possessed. D'Anville's 1747 atlas was, in significant part, a European digest of that Jesuit survey. The settlements he named in the Central Asian territories were not invented. They were drawn from sources, missionary reports, the Jesuit triangulation, earlier Qing administrative records that the missionaries had access to. The 14 settlements that appear in the 1747 edition and not in the revised literature of the 1820s are not uniformly distributed across Central Asia. They are concentrated in specific zones: the territories between the Caspian Sea and the Altai Mountains, the upper reaches of the Amu Darya Basin, the corridor between what is today Kazakhstan and western Siberia. These were territories that, in 1747, sat at the intersection of three expanding powers: the Russian Empire moving east, the Qing dynasty moving west, and the remnant Kazakh and Dzungar political structures that occupied the space between them. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of watching a named place disappear from a map between one edition and the next is not automatically evidence of suppression. It is, more commonly, evidence of a map correcting itself as better information becomes available. The history of cartography is substantially a history of names that were applied speculatively and then revised when ground-level survey replaced long-distance estimation. The question the Danville case raises is not whether revision happened, it is what kind of revision it was. Maybe the 14 settlements that disappeared from the European geographical record between 1747 and 1820 were simply cartographic errors. Names Danville had drawn from sources that turned out to be imprecise, corrected as Russian and Chinese administrative surveys replaced the Jesuit triangulation with more direct observation. If this were the whole picture, the disappearance of those 14 names would be a minor footnote in the history of cartographic revision. But the record is more specific than that. The Russian imperial geographical surveys of the late 18th century, the systematic mapping expeditions conducted under Catherine the Great and Paul I, which produced the first detailed administrative maps of Siberia and the Kazakh steppe, are in the archive. They document, in specific cases, the replacement of earlier settlement names with new designations as Russian administrative units were imposed on territories previously organized under different political structures. What they document in other cases is not replacement, it is absence. Settlements that Danville had named, drawn from the Jesuit sources, that the Russian surveys do not place, do not rename, and do not account for. Historians of Central Asian cartography note that this category of absent settlement requires a specific explanation that neither simple cartographic error nor deliberate suppression fully provides. The Jesuit sources were not unreliable across the board. Their triangulation data for territories the missionaries had physically surveyed has been verified by modern geographic analysis as remarkably accurate. The settlements Danville drew from those sources in other regions appear, with consistent coordinates, in subsequent mapping traditions. The 14 that do not appear are concentrated in the zones of most active Russian and Qing territorial consolidation between 1747 and 1820. That is not a conspiracy, it is a pattern. And the pattern has a specific documentary explanation that is more interesting than either the conspiratorial or the dismissive account. The Dzungar Khanate is where the record becomes most specific. The territory that Danville's 1747 atlas labeled most densely with named settlements, the region between the Altai Mountains and the Tian Shan Range, the corridor that historical geographers called Dzungaria, was, in 1747, the heartland of the Dzungar Confederation. The Dzungars were the last major nomadic empire of Central Asia, a Mongol-speaking Buddhist confederation that had, at its peak in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, controlled territory from Tibet to the Caspian and had fought the Qing dynasty to a strategic standstill for decades. Between 1755 and 1758, the Qing Emperor Qianlong conducted a military campaign against the Dzungar Confederation that historians of Central Asia describe as one of the most complete destructions of a political entity in the early modern period. The campaign resulted in the death or displacement of the majority of the Dzungar population. Estimates in the historical literature range from several 100,000 to over 1 million people killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The territory they had occupied was depopulated at a speed and scale that contemporary Qing sources document in specific administrative language. The Qing called it a pacification. The administrative records use the language of territorial incorporation. What the records describe, in their operational detail, is the physical removal of the population that had occupied a specific territory, and the subsequent resettlement of that territory with different populations under Qing administrative control. Danville's 1747 atlas was compiled before the Qing campaign against the Dzungars. The settlements he named in Dzungaria were drawn from Jesuit sources that predated the campaign. They were real settlements, not cartographic inventions, that existed when the sources Danville used were gathered. By 1758, the campaign was over. By 1820, when European geographers revised their Central Asian maps using Russian and Qing sources, the settlements were gone. Not renamed, not relocated. Gone. Because the population that had built and occupied them had been destroyed or dispersed in the intervening decades. The 14 cities were not erased from the map. They were erased from the territory, and the map followed. The Qing administrative records documenting the campaign against the Dzungars are in the archive. In the Qing veritable records, the Shilu, which were maintained as the official chronicle of imperial governance, and which document, in specific military and administrative language, the destruction of Dzungar settlements and the resettlement of the conquered territory. Scholars of Qing history, including work published through the New Qing History Project in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, have analyzed these records in detail. What they document is not a mystery. It is one of the most thoroughly recorded cases of deliberate territorial depopulation in 18th century history. Recorded by the perpetrators in their own administrative language, for the purpose of demonstrating the completeness of their military and political achievement. If this framing is landing differently than the Tartaria content you've seen before, subscribe. The next investigation follows a different cartographic question, one where the archive contains something the official map left out. Not a hidden empire, something smaller and more specific and better documented. The Tartaria theory looks at Danville's 1747 atlas, sees settlements that do not appear in later maps, and concludes that a hidden civilization was deliberately suppressed by a coordinated falsification of the historical record. The theory is not supported by the documentary evidence, because the documentary evidence explains what happened to those settlements in specific, verifiable, and deeply uncomfortable terms. The settlements disappeared because the people who built them were killed. Not by a cartographic conspiracy, not by a mud flood, by a military campaign that the perpetrators documented in detail, that contemporaries observed and recorded, and that left a specific and traceable mark on the geography of Central Asia that is visible in the cartographic record if you know where to look. The Tartaria theory asks, why did the cities disappear from the map? The archive answers, because the Qing Empire destroyed them, documented that it had destroyed them, and then governed the empty territory for the next century. The map changed because the territory changed. The archive says exactly who changed it. The territory that Danville mapped in 1747 is today the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. That is not an incidental detail. The same administrative logic that the Qing Empire applied to Dzungaria after 1758. The deliberate replacement of one population with another. The imposition of centralized administrative control over a territory whose previous inhabitants had been destroyed or dispersed, has a documented continuation in the same geography across the following 2.5 centuries. The territory that was depopulated in the 1750s was repopulated under Qing governance. It was reorganized under Republican Chinese governance. It is administered today under a framework that the United Nations and multiple national governments have described in formal resolutions using language that echoes the Qing administrative records of 1758 in ways that historians of the region have noted explicitly. The Tartaria theory looks at this territory and sees a cartographic mystery, cities that vanished from maps without explanation. The archive looks at the same territory and sees a pattern of demographic destruction that has been documented across 3 centuries by multiple independent sources in the administrative language of the states that carried it out. The question the archive leaves open is not whether the cities existed. Danville's sources were real. The Jesuit triangulation was accurate. The settlements were there. The question the archive leaves open is whether the pattern it documents in 1758 and the pattern it documents today are the same answer to the same question. The map changed. The reason was never hidden. It was written down by the people who did it.